Welcome to Alfred Kazin Notes, a place where literature, ideas, and the minds of great writers come alive. Let's explore the thoughts behind the words.
I am so ready for this one, Sarah.
Me too, Michael.
Hey.
Because we are starting with something incredibly visceral today. I want you, the listener, to just picture this. You are floating weightlessly.
Completely untethered.
Right, completely untethered. And it's the dead of winter in Prague. So below you, you see the snow-covered spires of St. Vitus Cathedral. And they are just piercing through the night sky like these glowing needles.
It's a very striking image.
It is, and you can clearly see the winding ancient cobblestone streets twisting away below you. You can see the dark, freezing ribbon of the Vltava River cutting through the city. And the craziest part is you feel completely 100% lucid.
You're not groggy, you're not confused.
Exactly. In fact, you take a moment to reassure yourself. You think to yourself, I am a brilliant neuroscientist, I'm a rational person, I'm of sound mind. But then, and this is where it gets bad, the absolute terror of the situation actually sets in.
Because you look down.
You look down at yourself and you realize you don't have a body. You are entirely, impossibly disembodied.
It's just the ultimate state of cognitive dissonance, isn't it?
Right.
I mean, your consciousness, your inner voice, your sense of self, it all feels perfectly intact. Hyper alert, even.
Yeah.
You're taking in all this sensory data.
Yeah.
But your physical form, the very biological machinery that is supposedly generating that consciousness, is just completely absent.
Exactly, Michael. Or, well, it's absent from the sky above the cathedral anyway, because your highly trained medical mind instantly starts racing to rationalize this.
Right, you're trying to diagnose yourself.
You tell yourself, okay, this is a classic out-of-body experience. It has to be a hypoxic hallucination. Maybe it's triggered by severe trauma or some intense cocktail of anesthetics, because the logic is brutal here. If you are hallucinating this vividly, if your brain is misfiring this spectacularly, you must be dying.
But you're not. You're only 49 years old.
Yeah, you're healthy. You were just giving a lecture. And then, like a physical blow, the memory of what just happened hits you.
The memory of the ambush.
Yeah.
And that terrifying immediate realization of where your physical body actually resides in that exact moment.
Yes, your perspective shifts violently. Suddenly, you aren't looking at the cathedral anymore. You are looking at yourself.
Yeah, man.
Your physical body is strapped flat on its back, completely immobilized in a machine. And this isn't a hospital bed either.
No, it's something much worse.
It's this horrifying industrial contrivance that's humming with a very cruel mechanical purpose. It's buried deep in some subterranean chamber that smells of ozone and damp earth, and standing directly over your helpless, paralyzed body is a figure out of an absolute nightmare.
He looks like a primordial man.
Like something not even human. He's covered head to toe in cracked, filthy, dried mud. Only his eyes are visible through this earthen mask, and they're burning with this kind of righteous fury. Plus, there are ancient, jagged letters scored deeply across his forehead. Yeah. He speaks to your physical body with this hollow, resonant Slavic accent, telling you he is the protector of a woman you betrayed. He is torturing you. He's forcing a confession out of you through an intravenous line that is delivering a level of agonizing, burning pain that your mind can barely process.
What makes this scenario so incredibly compelling, Sarah, is the profound irony of it all.
How so?
Well, this neuroscientist, Dr. Catherine Solomon, is a woman who has spent her entire academic career firmly entrenched in the hard sciences, right? She's likely spent decades dismissing anecdotal accounts of near-death experiences as mere chemical dumps in a dying brain.
No, absolutely. She's a materialist.
Right. And now she suddenly finds herself trapped in the very phenomenon she sought to explain away. She's desperately, silently praying to whatever's listening that she might be one of the lucky few who actually snap back into their physical bodies.
It is such a visceral, suffocating way to start a story, and it's exactly where we are beginning today's deep dive. We are unpacking the incredibly suspenseful narrative of the thriller, The Secret of Secrets. But I want to set expectations for you right now, right up front.
Yeah, this isn't your average book club chat.
No, definitely not. If you think today's deep dive is just going to be a play-by-play of a fast-paced thriller, a simple story of a woman in peril in a frantic chase across Eastern Europe, think again.
I'm going way deeper than the plot.
What we are really doing today is unpacking the terrifyingly plausible science, the rich historical lore, and the really profound philosophical questions that are masterfully woven into the fabric of this story. We are going to explore the cutting-edge theories of Noetic Science, the incredibly dark history of clandestine CIA operations, and the ancient protective myths of Prague.
The narrative functions brilliantly as a Trojan horse, really.
I love that comparison.
It lures you in with the pacing of an espionage thriller. But once you're inside the gates, it confronts you with some of the most complex, paradigm-shifting questions facing modern neuroscience and quantum physics. Especially now, looking at this through the lens of 2026.
Yes. Let's talk about why this matters right now, in 2026. Because neural surveillance isn't just sci-fi anymore, Michael.
Not at all. I mean, we have private tech companies literally implanting highly advanced neural interfaces into human brains as we speak.
Right. We're currently having very real, very mainstream debates about cognitive privacy. Like, can your employer read your brainwaves to check your focus? Can the government subpoena your thoughts?
Exactly. So when Dan Brown introduces this concept of Project Threshold, a clandestine government operation designed to map and control human consciousness, it hits totally differently today than it would have even 5 years ago.
It feels urgent. It feels unsettlingly possible. And our central mission today, the thread we're going to pull through this entire exploration, boils down to one incredibly profound question. What if your brain doesn't actually generate your consciousness?
What if it merely receives it?
Exactly. What if your brain is just an antenna?
It's a question that threatens to upend everything we think we know about human existence. And to really grasp the stakes of the events unfolding in Prague, we have to rewind a bit and look at the woman floating above the cathedral, Dr. Kazin Note, and the bold claims she's making.
She is presented as a pioneer in noetic science, right?
Yeah, Noetic Science,
Yeah.
which is this multidisciplinary field that studies the nature of consciousness and its potential effects on the physical world.
So let's look at the setup for her theory, because it happens in a much more glamorous setting than that subterranean torture lab. Earlier in the evening, before everything just goes entirely wrong, Kazin is giving a highly anticipated lecture in the Renaissance chamber of the Four Seasons Hotel in Prague.
Quite the venue.
Oh, it's packed. Standing room only. And she's up there with Robert Langdon, who is serving as her self-described arm candy for the evening.
Which is just a fun dynamic.
It really is. She invites him on stage to do what he does best, analyze symbols. He walks the audience through the history of the halo in art.
The glowing ring around the head.
Right. He traces this glowing ring from the depictions of ancient Egyptian sun gods to the golden auras in Buddhist iconography, all the way up to the spiked crown on the Statue of Liberty.
So he establishes the halo as a universal human symbol, a shared visual archetype.
He does. But Kazin takes that historical analysis and she pivots sharply into the realm of radical biology. She uses the halo not as a symbol of divine blessing, but as an ancient, intuitive representation of an expanded, non-local consciousness.
She looks out at this room full of academics and wealthy patrons and drops her central thesis. Consciousness is not produced by the brain, and it is not confined to the head at all.
Which is basically throwing a live grenade into a room full of traditional scientists.
Oh, a massive grenade.
Because, for centuries, the prevailing scientific consensus, what we call materialism, has dictated that everything about you, every thought you've ever had, every emotion, every memory, the very feeling of being you, is simply the byproduct of physical matter interacting.
Whiteware, basically.
Exactly. In the materialist view, your brain is just a highly evolved biological meat computer. The neurons fire, the chemicals exchange, and consciousness is just the software running on that hardware.
And the inescapable conclusion of materialism is pretty bleak, isn't it?
It is. It says that when the computer turns off, when the oxygen stops flowing and the brain dies, the software stops running, the screen goes black. End of story forever.
That is the grim, absolute reality that materialism presents. But Kazin argues that we are standing on the precipice of a scientific revolution that will dwarf the Copernican schist.
Just as humanity once violently resisted the idea that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe.
Right. Modern academia violently resists the idea that the brain isn't the center of consciousness. She points to phenomena that mainstream science routinely sweeps under the rug. Things like telepathy, precognition, remote viewing, and validated out-of-body experiences. She argues that these aren't anomalies, they are clues to a fundamentally different reality.
And she backs this up by calling out a massive and very real controversy currently plaguing modern academia, right? The replication crisis.
Oh, absolutely. It is a foundational issue in modern science. The gold standard of the scientific method is reproducibility. If I conduct an experiment and discover a new physical law, you should be able to follow my exact methodology in your lab and get the exact same result.
And if you can't,
Then my findings are considered invalid. Over the last decade or so, a shocking percentage of studies, especially in psychology and neuroscience, have completely failed to replicate.
But Catherine takes this a step further, Michael. She argues that this crisis has been weaponized by the scientific establishment to protect the materialist status quo.
Precisely. Because phenomena involving human consciousness, especially non-local consciousness, often interact with the unpredictable nature of the quantum realm. They are deeply sensitive to the state of the observer.
Which makes them hard to measure in a sterile lab.
Exactly. Catherine suggests that highly respected scientists who dare to research these areas have had their groundbreaking work marginalized or outright dismissed as fraudulent, simply because it doesn't fit neatly into the materialist Newtonian framework.
She brings up some specific examples, doesn't she?
She does. She specifically cites the famous Ganzfeld experiment on telepathy, which showed statistically significant anomalies over decades. And she mentions Daryl Bem's highly controversial research at Cornell on retrocausality.
Retrocausality. That's the mind-bending idea that a future event can actually influence a person's physiological response in the present, right?
Essentially, yes. Like your body reacting to a jump scare before the jump scare actually happens on the screen.
Wait, really? Your body knows it's coming before it happens?
According to Bem's studies, yes. They suggested that the human nervous system could anticipate randomized, emotionally evocative stimuli seconds before a computer actually generated them.
That is wild.
And when Bem published this in a major psychology journal, the academic backlash was ferocious. The establishment didn't just question his methodology. They sought to discredit the very premise of the inquiry. Catherine uses this to argue that science has become dogmatic, basically blinding itself to the truth because the truth is too strange to measure with conventional yardsticks.
But Catherine isn't just up there philosophizing or complaining about academic politics. This is where her argument gets real teeth. She brings the hard neurochemistry, and she focuses on one specific, incredibly important neurotransmitter called GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid.
This is where the noetic theory finds its biological anchor. In neuroscience, GABA is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter.
So if glutamate is the gas pedal, firing up your neurons and making them excited...
GABA is the brake pedal.
Yes.
Its primary job is to reduce neuronal excitability throughout the central nervous system. It calms things down. It prevents your brain from short-circuiting. But Catherine theorizes that GABA serves an even more profound purpose. She claims it acts as a biological chemical filter for reality itself.
A filter? I love this concept. Let's unpack how that actually works.
Think about the sheer volume of information surrounding you at any given moment, Sarah. The electromagnetic spectrum, the quantum fluctuations, the infinite interconnectedness of the universe.
It's too much.
Way too much. If the human mind, in its default waking state, were exposed to the unfiltered, infinite reality of the cosmos, it would be instantly overwhelmed. We wouldn't be able to hunt, gather, or procreate. We would be paralyzed by the awe and terror of the infinite.
So evolutionary biology intervened.
Over millions of years, our brains evolved to secrete a heavy, constant dose of GABA to keep us tethered. It acts as a set of neurological blinders, restricting our consciousness to a very narrow, manageable bandwidth of reality so we can just focus on immediate physical survival.
This makes so much sense when you look at the example she provides in the text. Take babies, for instance. The human infant is born with extraordinarily high levels of GABA flooding its developing brain.
Most people assume that's just for sleep and growth.
Right, but Catherine posits this isn't just for physical growth, it's a profound evolutionary protection mechanism. A baby hasn't yet developed the cognitive framework to process this three-dimensional reality, so the brain swamps itself in GABA to shield the infant from catastrophic sensory overload. It keeps them insulated while their localized earthly consciousness gradually boots up.
And we see the manipulation of this filter in certain advanced spiritual practices too. Tibetan monks, for example. Through decades of rigorous, disciplined meditation, they learn to consciously modulate their neurochemistry.
They can manually adjust the filter.
Exactly. They can intentionally elevate their GABA levels, essentially thickening the filter to block out all external physical stimuli, pain, cold, hunger, allowing them to achieve a state of profound singular focus.
But the real turning point in her research, the thing that actually puts a target on her back, is when she asks the inverse question. What happens when the filter breaks? What happens when those GABA levels plummet drastically and suddenly?
When the veil falls.
Right. Because if GABA is the biological blinder keeping us trapped in the material world, a sudden drop means the blinders are ripped off. And she points to very specific, extreme human experiences where this happens. Near-death experiences, for one.
When the body goes into severe physiological shock and vital signs crash, the regulatory systems fail, and GABA plummets.
Exactly. Or consider the ingestion of powerful entheogenic psychedelics like DMT or high-dose psilocybin. These compounds chemically override the brain's inhibitory networks. And perhaps most fascinatingly, she points to the post-ictal state.
The post-ictal state is the period of profound exhaustion and disorientation that immediately follows an epileptic seizure. During a massive seizure, the brain essentially burns through its supply of neurotransmitters. The electrical storm completely exhausts the inhibitory systems. So in the minutes or hours following the event, the brain's GABA levels are practically non-existent.
And what happens in all three of these states? Near death, deep psychedelic trips, and post-seizure. People consistently report the exact same phenomena across cultures and centuries.
Profoundly expansive, life-altering experiences.
Yes, they report full life recall, a feeling of infinite universal interconnectedness, encountering entities, and most crucially, a profound sense that their consciousness is existing entirely outside of their physical bodies.
I want to make sure we are really visualizing this. Let me throw an analogy out here for you guys.
Go for it. Imagine your brain is not an orchestra sitting on a stage, generating its own original music from its instruments. Imagine instead that your brain is just a radio receiver, a highly complex biological antenna. The music, your consciousness, your soul is actually a signal broadcasting all around us all the time through a medium we can't fully measure yet.
Like a quantum field.
Exactly. Your specific brain is just attuned to a specific localized station. Now, if you take a sledgehammer and smash that radio to pieces, the music stops playing in your living room. But the music didn't die. The broadcast is still out there in the airwaves, completely untouched. You just destroyed the local hardware required to translate it into sound.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize the noetic paradigm, Sarah. The music of your consciousness is entirely independent of the physical destruction of the hardware. It is fundamentally non-local. And when the GABA filter drops, the radio tuner suddenly unlocks, allowing the receiver to pick up on all the other frequencies simultaneously.
But hold on, Michael, when you really think about the implications of that, if Catherine actually has proof of this, not just philosophical musings, but replicable scientific proof that consciousness can exist untethered from the physical body, that changes the world.
It changes everything.
But it doesn't just bring about an era of spiritual enlightenment. Think about human nature. If you can definitively separate the observer from the physical form, you have just created the ultimate, completely untraceable surveillance tool.
And that realization is the terrifying pivot point of the narrative. Because an idea that powerful doesn't stay in the realm of academia for long. If the human consciousness can be systematically untethered and directed, it immediately becomes the single most valuable intelligence asset on the planet.
A literal ghost in the machine.
Exactly. And there are massive, incredibly well-funded forces in the shadows who view Catherine's spiritual awakening not as a miracle, but as a weapons system.
Which brings us crashing down from the lofty heights of philosophy into the grim reality of clandestine operations. Let's talk about Everett Finch and Project Threshold. Because while Catherine is standing on a stage in Prague lecturing about the eternal beauty of the human soul, Everett Finch is executing a devastating military-grade cyber attack on her life's work back in New York.
The contrast is stark. We cut over to Jonas Forkman, Catherine's dedicated editor at Penguin Random House. It's late at night, and he is immersed in reading her newly completed, groundbreaking manuscript. The project is highly classified within the publisher, codenamed SUMM Solomon Untitled Manuscript.
A great acronym.
As he's reading, this highly secure virtual workspace is violently breached.
It's not a subtle hack either. It's a digital home invasion. A young, terrified data technician named Alex Conan is helpless to stop it. They watch their screens as an automated, incredibly aggressive purging program systematically scrubs every single trace of Catherine's research, every draft, every email attachment from the publisher's main servers.
And it doesn't stop there. It hunts down and incinerates the redundant backup servers housed in a secure facility in Maryland. It's a total wipe.
Finch isn't trying to steal the intellectual property to use it. He is executing a scorched earth protocol to erase the theory's existence from the public domain entirely. And Finch, we learn, is not just some rogue hacker. He is a highly trained, ruthless covert operative stationed in London, working for a shadowy entity known as In-Q-Tel.
For those who don't know, In-Q-Tel is a real thing. It's essentially the venture capital arm of the Central Intelligence Agency. They invest in high-tech startups to ensure the U.S. intelligence community is equipped with the latest technology.
But in this narrative, Finch is using that unlimited black budget funding to run something deeply illegal called Project Threshold.
To truly grasp the horror of Project Threshold, we need to understand the historical precedent, Sarah. The CIA has a long, documented, and very dark history of trying to weaponize the human mind. The narrative explicitly connects Threshold to its real-world predecessor, the Stargate Project.
Oh, the Stargate project is fascinating. This was during the height of the Cold War. The CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency were absolutely terrified that the Soviets were outpacing them in, psi intelligence. They genuinely believed the KGB was using psychics to steal state secrets.
So the U.S. government poured millions of dollars into studying remote viewing. They recruited individuals with supposed anomalous cognitive abilities, people like the famous psychic Ingo Swann. The goal was to see if a human mind sitting in a dark room in Fort Meade, Maryland, could project its consciousness across the globe to peek inside Soviet submarine bases, map classified facilities, or locate hostages in the Middle East.
But the official history says Stargate was a failure, right? It was eventually declassified and shut down in the mid-90s because the intelligence was deemed too noisy, too unreliable, and frankly, politically embarrassing.
That is the official narrative. But the secret of secrets posits a deeply cynical, yet entirely plausible alternative. What if the public shutdown was merely a smokescreen?
Oh, I love that theory.
What if the intense public indignation over tax dollars funding psychics simply provided the perfect cover for the agency to take the research completely black? Project Threshold is the modernized, terrifyingly high-tech evolution of Stargate. The Cold War researchers were fumbling in the dark with natural psychics. Threshold brings industrial, pharmaceutical, and cybernetic precision to the table.
And they built this nightmare factory deep beneath the streets of Prague. They hid it right in plain sight underneath a seemingly normal public park called Famanka Park. They retrofitted an abandoned, massive Soviet-era bomb shelter. When Robert Langdon and Catherine finally infiltrate this facility, the contrast is jarring.
They expect to find something out of a mystical text, but what they find is straight out of a clinical sci-fi body horror film.
There are no dim lights and tarot cards here. It's a sterile, industrial environment. They find an operating room dominated by an imposing robotic surgical suite equipped with cranial immobilization screws.
Meaning they are drilling into skulls.
Yes. And adjacent to that, a massive space labeled immersive computing.
This is where the methodology of Threshold is laid bare, and it is chilling. They realized that waiting for a natural psychic to have a good day was incredibly inefficient, so they decided to mechanically force the human mind into these non-local states, and they do this using EPR pods.
Walk us through what an EPR pod actually does.
EPR stands for Emergency Preservation and Resuscitation. This is a technology based on real experimental medical procedures designed for severe trauma patients. The pods are designed to rapidly induce profound hypothermia. They drain the patient's warm blood and replace it with an ice-cold saline solution.
They are essentially killing them.
Yes, it induces clinical death. The heart stops, brain function slows to an almost undetectable crawl. The cellular need for oxygen plummets, preventing brain damage. But more importantly, for Threshold's purposes, this artificial near-death state completely crashes the brain's GABA filters.
The biological blinders are forcibly ripped away.
Exactly. And as if stopping a person's heart isn't extreme enough, while the subjects are clinically dead, they are administered a cocktail of powerful illegal psychedelics through automated intravenous lines.
We're talking about massive doses of synthesized DMT, psilocybin, distilled salvia extract, and MDMA. They are blasting the unshielded consciousness into the stratosphere.
And they include Rohypnol in that cocktail, the date rape drug.
Why Rohypnol?
This is crucial because it induces anterograde amnesia. The subjects are subjected to this unimaginable trauma of forced disembodiment, but they are chemically prevented from forming conscious memories of the torture when they are revived.
That is just purely evil. But dropping the filter and launching the mind isn't enough to make a spy. You have to be able to steer the drone, right? And that's where the immersive computing room comes in. They combine these extreme chemical and physiological states with highly advanced virtual reality.
They place these subjects in specialized reclining hydraulic chairs, strap VR headsets to them, and flood their senses with specific spatial data. By doing this repeatedly, they are harnessing the power of neuroplasticity. They are physically forcing the brain to grow new neural pathways, essentially rewiring the subject's consciousness to feel comfortable, oriented, and controllable while existing completely outside their physical bodies.
Okay, wait. Let's think about the mechanics of this, Michael. You have a brain pumped full of cold saline, tripping on DMT, hooked to a VR headset. How on earth does the CIA actually get the data out of the floating mind? How does a disembodied consciousness report back to a hard drive?
That is the exact missing link Catherine discovers inside the lab. She finds a highly classified black binder from a Swedish laboratory detailing the final, crucial piece of the puzzle, the development of artificial neurons.
Right, because biological brains communicate using ions, sodium, potassium, calcium moving across cell membranes. It's wet chemical electricity. But computers communicate using electrons moving through silicon wire. You can't just plug a USB cable into a hippocampus.
Exactly, you need a bridge. The binder details the use of a highly specific organic polymer called benzimidazobenzophenanthrene.
Try saying that 3 times fast. What is it?
Benzimidazobenzophenanthrene. It is a mouthful, but what it actually does is remarkable. In simple terms, it's a specialized conductive plastic. Because it's an organic polymer, it doesn't trigger the brain's massive immune response the way an inserted metal electrode would.
Oh, so the brain just accepts it as biological tissue.
Precisely. But functionally, it acts as an organic electrochemical transistor. It can literally translate the biological ionic signals of human thought into the electronic digital signals understood by a computer, and vice versa. It bridges the gap between flesh and machine seamlessly.
And this is where the story delivers a devastating emotional gut punch to Catherine. She looks at the chemical structure of this polymer in the binder, and she recognizes it immediately. She realizes the CIA stole this exact concept, this specific polymer application, from her own doctoral thesis that she wrote 23 years ago at MIT.
It is a profound, almost intimate violation. She recalls her academic advisor at the time strongly urging her to apply for a patent on this theoretical work, a patent he almost certainly knew would be rejected for security reasons.
Meaning the concept would be flagged, seized, and funneled straight into the black budget intelligence community.
Yes, her life's work, which she intended to prove the spiritual elegance of the universe, was stolen and perverted to build a neural mesh, a physical net woven into the human brain to trap and control the soul.
And that is the ultimate goal of Project Threshold. Finch coldly refers to the end product as psychonauts.
Psychonauts. It sounds like an old 1960s sci-fi comic book, but the reality is pure horror. They are creating human beings who can be forcibly pushed out of their bodies, their consciousness completely untethered, but electronically tethered to a server, acting as invisible, unstoppable drones.
So a psychonaut could float into a locked vault in Beijing, read a classified document, and transmit the text back to a computer in Prague using the neural mesh while their physical body remains safely on ice.
That's the terrifying vision, yes.
But this raises a really disturbing logistical question. You can't just drill into a random person's skull and install a neural mesh. The brain would reject it, or the psychological shock would break them. Who are they experimenting on? The story introduces us to a young woman named Sasha Vesner. Why her?
That is where we meet Dr. Bria Gessner, the brilliant but deeply unethical Czech neuroscientist running the medical side of Threshold for Finch. Gessner realized that the trauma of forcing a healthy brain into an out-of-body state was just too destructive. So she sought out minds that were already biologically predisposed to slipping their moorings. She targeted patients with severe temporal lobe epilepsy.
Oh, because of the postictal state we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Sasha's brain, following a seizure, naturally crashes its GABA filters. Her mind already knows how to cross the threshold. Gessner approached Sasha, playing the role of a savior. She promised her a revolutionary, highly experimental, responsive neurostimulation chip that would monitor her brainwaves and intercept her debilitating seizures before they could start.
It was a horrific lie. She wasn't curing Sasha. She was surgically implanting the advanced benzimidazobenzophenanthrene neural mesh to monitor and eventually control Sasha's consciousness. Sasha wasn't a patient receiving cutting-edge care. She was designated in the files as patient number 2.
The tragedy of Sasha Vesner is profound. She genuinely believes she has been granted a miracle, that she finally has her life and independence back. She has absolutely no idea she's secretly being used as a biological testbed, subjected to chemically induced out-of-body torture while she sleeps, her memories chemically wiped clean by the Rohypnol.
It's stomach churning. Again, there is a fundamental rule of biology and psychology. When you take a complex system, like the human mind, and you subject it to relentless trauma, when you hack it, drug it, and torture it, it doesn't always just passively break down.
No, it adapts.
Sometimes the system fights back in ways you cannot predict, and that brings us to the most conceptually fascinating, terrifying element of this entire narrative, the Golem of Prague.
To fully appreciate the impact of the golem in this story, we first have to ground ourselves in the actual mythology of the city. Prague is a city heavily steeped in alchemy, magic, and dark folklore. And the most enduring legend is that of Rabbi Judah Loew in the late 16th century.
Right. The story goes that the Jewish community in Prague was facing severe existential persecution and pogroms. They were defenseless, so Rabbi Loew, a master of Kabbalistic mysticism, went to the muddy banks of the Vltava River. He sculpted a massive humanoid figure out of the clay.
He used ancient rituals to animate the mud, bringing it to life by inscribing the Hebrew word emet, which translates to truth, on the creature's forehead. The golem became an unstoppable, tireless protector of the innocent.
But there's a catch with the golem, isn't there?
Yes, the legend always carries a dark, cautionary coda. The golem lacks a human soul. As it continues to fight, it becomes increasingly overwhelmed by its own capacity for violence. It becomes a blunt instrument of rage, eventually turning its destructive power against the very people it was built to protect.
Forcing the rabbi to stop it. And he does this by simply reaching up and erasing the first letter of the word on its forehead. By removing the aleph, the word emet, truth, becomes met, which means death. And the magical protector crumbles instantly back into lifeless, inert clay.
That historical and thematic context is absolutely crucial.
Right.
Because when the golem appears in The Secret of Secrets, it is not a metaphor.
Yeah.
It is a very real, incredibly dangerous physical entity stalking the snowy modern streets of Prague.
It's terrifying. We see this massive figure draped in a heavy cloak, wearing platform boots to increase his height, and his face is hidden behind a dried, cracked mask of actual clay with the word emet deeply etched into his forehead.
And he is ruthless. He operates with military precision and terrifying strength. We see him brutally murder Dr. Gessner in her home, the ultimate retribution for her medical betrayal. Later, he tracks down and kills Michael Harris, a CIA operative embedded in the U.S. Embassy.
The author builds this up to make you question the reality of the narrative. Like, is magic real in this universe? Did someone actually animate mud? But then the story executes a massive, brilliantly constructed psychological twist.
It's one of the best parts of the book.
The golem is not a hired mercenary in a mask. And he certainly isn't a magical clay monster. The golem is a highly developed dissociative identity disorder, a DID alter ego that exists entirely within the shattered mind of the epileptic patient, Sasha Vesner.
When I read that reveal, I had to stop and go back. It is stunning. And the text doesn't just treat DID as a cheap plot device. It delves deeply into the agonizing biological and psychological reality of how such an entity is formed.
The narrative takes us into Sasha's tragic childhood in rural Russia. Because of her severe epilepsy, she was heavily stigmatized and harassed by her community. Her parents, desperate and ignorant, institutionalized her in a grim, Soviet-style psychiatric facility.
A nightmare scenario.
There, isolated from her family, she endured years of horrific neglect, physical abuse, and psychological torment, primarily orchestrated by a profoundly cruel nurse named Mulvina.
We have to remember how the mind works here, Sarah. A child's psyche is fragile. When a child is subjected to unrelenting trauma from which there is no physical escape, the mind really only has one option for survival. It fractures. It builds a wall.
Precisely. In the crucible of that Russian asylum, Sasha's consciousness broke. To protect the core identity from experiencing pain that would literally destroy its will to live, her mind birthed a new identity, a fiercely protective, hypervigilant, uncompromisingly aggressive male persona, the golem.
And the golem's very first act of existence, moments after being born in Sasha's mind, was to lash out and kill Nurse Mulvina to save the host body. From that moment on, he became Sasha's unseen, violent guardian angel.
What makes this portrayal so fascinating is how intimately the author details the golem's internal, subjective experience of reality. He does not think of himself as Sasha in a costume. He views himself as a completely separate, superior entity trapped in a fragile biological vessel.
He refers to the body he shares with Sasha simply as the shell. He actually feels a deep revulsion toward his physical weaknesses.
The logistics of his existence are fascinating. He only fronts, meaning takes control of the body, when Sasha is deeply asleep or incapacitated. He maintains a secret, blacked-out apartment on an upper floor right above Sasha's flat. The windows are sealed. It's illuminated only by harsh UV lights.
And up there, he undergoes his physical transformation. He applies thick layers of mineral-rich futaba mud from the riverbank, mixed with theatrical makeup and adhesives, building the physical mask of the golem onto Sasha's face to match his internal self-image.
He even manages the epilepsy. He perceives the impending seizures not as a neurological misfire, but as a malevolent, creeping force he calls the ether, threatening to consume the shell. He uses a small, conductive metal rod, what he calls his epilepsy wand, and violently rubs it against his skull, attempting to manually ground the erratic electrical storms firing in the temporal lobe.
And his relationship with Sasha's consciousness is profoundly complex.
Yeah.
He actively suppresses her. When he needs to operate, he forces her core identity into a deep, suspended void.
Sasha experiences these prolonged periods of missing time, but because she has severe epilepsy, she completely rationalizes the blackouts as post-seizure memory loss.
She has absolutely no idea she is sharing her body with a killer.
None. The golem keeps her in the dark to protect her from the horrors of the world, but more recently he is suppressing her to protect her from the horrific reality of the CIA experiments she is unwittingly subjected to at Threshold.
Think about this in terms of our earlier technology analogy, Sarah. If the brain is a computer, the golem is basically a biological firewall.
Oh, that's brilliant.
When Sasha's operating system was hacked and corrupted by unspeakable trauma beyond its absolute limits, first by the systemic abuse in the asylum, and later by the invasive neural mesh at the CIA, her psyche executed a desperate survival protocol. It wrote a piece of highly aggressive, autonomous antivirus software.
The golem is designed with one single directive: isolate the threat to the host system and destroy it with extreme prejudice, even if it means completely taking over the hardware and locking the primary user, Sasha, out of her own system.
That is a perfect framework for understanding his actions. The golem is a trauma response weaponized by sheer necessity. He operates on absolute binary logic.
Yeah.
He discovers that Dr. Gestner, the woman Sasha trusted deeply, betrayed her and turned her into a lab rat. He discovers that Michael Harris, the man Sasha was falling in love with, is actually an undercover U.S. Embassy operative assigned to monitor her for the CIA.
So to the golem, these are critical threats to the shell, and he acts with cold, calculated, brutal retribution. He eliminates the threats.
But the golem's surgical strikes create absolute, sprawling chaos in the waking world of Prague. His actions trigger a massive manhunt by local authorities and panic within the CIA, and Robert Langdon and Catherine Solomon end up caught dead center in the crossfire of this conspiracy.
Which leads us to one of the most tense, intellectually thrilling sequences in the entire story: the Clementinum chase.
Let's set the tactical board. Langdon has been separated from Catherine in the chaos. He is desperately trying to locate her, but he is actively being hunted through the city by a rogue, highly dangerous Czech intelligence officer named Leti Pavel.
Pavel is a fantastic antagonist in this sequence because he's not evil, he's just acting on bad information. He genuinely believes Langdon murdered his commanding officer, Captain Novak, earlier in the night, so Pavel is out for blood.
While evading Pavel, Langdon receives a cryptic, seemingly blank email from Catherine. Attached to it is a strange, complex graphic. Langdon, utilizing his expertise in symbology, recognizes the strange characters. It's written in Enochian.
Enochian. For the uninitiated, Enochian is a fascinating piece of real esoteric history. It's an occult, constructed language recorded in the late 16th century by John Dee, who was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, and his scryer, Edward Kelly. They claimed it was the literal language of the angels, dictated to them through crystal gazing.
The use of Enochian is a brilliant thematic touch. It connects the deep historical mysticism of Prague with the modern pursuit of non-local consciousness. Langdon deciphers the angelic script and realizes Catherine isn't giving him an address. She's referencing a specific, infamous artifact, the Codex Gigas, more commonly known as the Devil's Bible.
The largest extant medieval illuminated manuscript in the world. And Langdon knows exactly where it is currently housed. That realization leads him straight to the Clementinum, an incredibly beautiful, sprawling complex of historical buildings in Prague, specifically into the breathtaking Baroque library, which is right next to the exhibition hall displaying the codex.
He manages to find Catherine hiding among the ancient stacks, but his arrival compromises her position. Elton Pavel has tracked Langdon's movements. Pavel infiltrates the building and systematically locks down the library, trapping Langdon and Catherine inside this massive ornate cage of wood and paper.
And Pavel is terrifyingly methodical. He's heavily armed, enraged, and hunting them through the aisles. He even starts pushing a massive, incredibly heavy, bulletproof glass display case across the floor. He intends to use it as an elevated platform to shoot down at them from the upper balcony, basically turning the library into a shooting gallery.
Langdon realizes their situation is mathematically hopeless. They are cornered, they have absolutely no weapons, they cannot fight a trained tactical officer, they need an immediate massive distraction to break the lockdown. He turns to Catherine and tells her he needs fire.
It's a great MacGyver moment. He takes a small bottle of alcohol-based hand sanitizer from Catherine's bag. He rips the USB connector plug off her phone charger, completely stripping the wires down to the bare copper, and uses a nearby electrical outlet to spark a flash fire right there on the polished wooden floor of a priceless historical library.
But a flash of blue alcohol flame isn't enough to trigger the massive, building-wide fire suppression systems. He needs dense, choking smoke. He needs fuel. And this is where the narrative forces a truly agonizing choice. Langdon asks Catherine for the only fuel available, her physical manuscript.
The SUM manuscript.
Yes. The physical binder she is carrying is the absolute last existing copy of her life's work. Remember, Finch's cyber attack utterly annihilated every digital trace, every backup, every note on the publisher's servers. This stack of paper is all that remains of decades of research, her doctorate thesis, her noetic theories, all of it. And Langdon tells her he needs to burn it.
I found myself pausing the story here just to process the sheer psychological horror of this moment. It's an incredible cinematic set piece. The smoke rising, the alarms blaring, the museum staff panicking, the U.S. Embassy Marines eventually breaching the doors to extract them. It functions perfectly as an escape tactic. But put yourself in Catherine's shoes.
It's devastating.
She has dedicated her entire adult life to proving that human consciousness is eternal. This manuscript is her magnum opus. It's her soul in paper form. And she has to stand there, shivering in a library, and watch the man she trusts toss her entire legacy into a fire just to buy them 30 minutes of physical safety. How does a human being recover from that kind of intellectual devastation?
It feels like a profound, irreversible tragedy. It feels like Finch won. But as the adrenaline settles and they escape the immediate danger, the narrative reveals the brilliant nuance of Langdon's actions. It was an act of masterful, high-stakes misdirection.
Because he didn't burn it all.
Exactly. Langdon didn't burn the core manuscript. He carefully removed the dense bibliography and a stack of blank separator pages, and he threw those into the fire, creating the perfect visual illusion of total destruction while quietly preserving the vital text of her theory.
It's an intellectual sleight of hand.
It is. And this specific act of misdirection is not just a clever plot twist. It perfectly mirrors the broader philosophical themes of the entire novel. The book constantly hammers home the idea that what you see is rarely the whole truth. Visual reality is easily manipulated.
Whether it's the CIA disguising a horrific black site laboratory as an innocuous park renovation project,
or the golem disguising his true psychological identity beneath layers of literal and metaphorical clay.
or Langdon disguising a desperate rescue as an act of senseless destruction.
Exactly. It's a survival tactic specifically designed to defeat a surveillance state. Finch and the CIA operate on absolute visual control. If they monitor the library cameras and see the manuscript turn to ash, the threat is neutralized in their minds. They stop hunting for the paper. By sacrificing the illusion of the work, Langdon guarantees the survival of the actual ideas.
That is a perfect transition to the climax, because this theme, an act of necessary, highly calculated destruction to ensure long-term survival, directly parallels the explosive finale of the story. While Langdon manages to save Catherine's work with a small fire, the golem is preparing to make an infinitely larger, much more permanent sacrifice to protect Sasha.
Let's head back down to the dark. Let's talk about the helium quench.
Oh, this sequence is unbelievable.
The narrative convergence brings everyone back inside the subterranean nightmare of Threshold. Everett Finch, utilizing the chaos above ground, has managed to capture both Langdon and Catherine. He has them secured inside the massive concrete blast dome of the laboratory. Finch is arrogant. He believes he has won. He's monologuing, holding them at gunpoint, explaining the horrifying global scope of his psychonaut program.
He's relishing his victory, but he doesn't realize he's locked in the room with the apex predator, because from the shadows of the facility's pneumatic lift, The golem emerges.
He has been hiding, listening, assessing the threat.
He is physically exhausted, battered from his earlier fights, and desperately fighting off the creeping ether of an impending seizure, but his singular directive remains intact. He attacks.
The physical confrontation is brutal and swift. The golem's sheer mass and ferocity overwhelm Finch. He disarms the operative, subdues him, and in an act of profound, terrifying poetic justice, the golem drags Finch to one of the empty EPR pods, throws him inside, and locks the heavy glass lid.
It is deeply satisfying. But the golem's mission isn't just about punishing Finch. It's about systemic eradication. He recognizes that the facility itself, the robotic drills, the immersive computing network, the chemical vats, is a perpetual threat. He is there to ensure that Threshold can never, ever hurt Sasha or anyone else again. He initiates the total destruction of the underground lab.
And what elevates this sequence from a standard action climax is the hard science behind the sabotage. He doesn't set a block of C4 with a blinking red timer. He turns the laboratory's own physics against it.
Yes. Let's break down the science of this because it is absolutely fascinating.
To run the massive electromagnetic fields required for the sensory deprivation and neural mesh interfacing, Threshold is powered by a superconducting magnetic energy storage system, or SMEs. These are real, incredibly powerful systems. They store immense amounts of electrical energy, not in chemical batteries, but in a massive magnetic field created by the continuous flow of direct current through a specialized superconducting coil.
But the key word there is superconducting. For a material, usually a niobium titanium alloy, to achieve superconductivity, meaning it allows electricity to flow with absolutely zero electrical resistance, it has to be cooled to an extreme degree.
Yes, cryogenic temperatures. We're talking about cooling the coils to temperatures nearing absolute zero. And to maintain that impossible cold, the SMES system relies on vast pressurized containment tanks filled with liquid helium constantly bathing the coils. The golem, having observed the facility's operations during his covert intrusions, understands this fundamental vulnerability. He accesses the main utility vault and begins manually turning the massive cutoff valves, shutting down the flow of liquid helium to the coils.
Which initiates a catastrophic physical reaction known as a quench. Walk us through the mechanics of a quench, Michael.
When the cooling stops, the temperature of the coils begins to rise instantly. As soon as the niobium titanium alloy warms just a few degrees above absolute zero, it abruptly loses its superconductivity. Suddenly, the massive, unimpeded flow of electrical current meets extreme electrical resistance. This generates an unfathomable spike of intense, instantaneous heat, what physicists call ohmic heating.
And that heat transfers directly into whatever liquid helium is still in the chamber.
Exactly. The remaining liquid helium boils instantly. It undergoes a massive, violent phase change from liquid to gas.
And the expansion ratio is what makes it a bomb. Liquid helium expanding into a gas increases in volume by a ratio of roughly 1 to 700.
Right, so imagine a bathtub full of liquid instantly expanding to fill an entire house with high-pressure gas. Inside a confined, heavily armored subterranean bunker, that rapidly expanding gas has nowhere to go. The pressure builds exponentially in fractions of a second until it violently breaches the containment vessels. It creates a catastrophic, uncontainable pressure bomb.
The sheer concussive force obliterates the delicate machinery, shatters the concrete, and causes the ground in Famanka Park above to literally erupt in a massive geyser of freezing gas, dirt, and pulverized concrete.
It levels the entire billion-dollar project. The threat is completely neutralized. But the most emotionally resonant, truly heartbreaking part of this climax isn't the physics of the explosion. It's what the golem does in the aftermath.
He manages to escape the blast radius through a service tram tunnel.
Yeah. He is battered, exhausted, and the seizure is finally overtaking the host body. He makes it back to the sanctuary of Sasha's apartment. The author gives us this incredibly poignant, quiet moment after the deafening noise of the blast. The golem stands before his mirror looking at his hulking reflection, the dried, cracking clay mask under the harsh UV light. He knows his time is at an end.
His prime directive has been fulfilled. The people who hurt Sasha are dead. The machine that controlled her mind is destroyed.
The threats have been neutralized, yes. He understands that his continued existence, his violent nature, his need to suppress Sasha's core identity is now the only remaining danger to her. So he slowly raises his heavy finger to his forehead, to the jagged Hebrew word, emet truth. And with immense effort, he forcefully scrapes away the first letter, the aleph.
Changing the word from emet to met, from truth to death.
It is a profoundly poetic, deeply sad psychological resolution. By altering the word, he is voluntarily initiating his own psychological termination. He relinquishes control of the body permanently. He accepts his own death so that the fractured pieces of Sasha's mind can finally begin to heal and reintegrate. He allows her to return to the light, unburdened by the trauma that necessitated his violent existence.
It left me staring at the wall, honestly, because it raises such a profound, difficult question. Is the golem's death a tragedy? We spend the whole book terrified of him, but ultimately we grow to deeply understand him, to see his fierce, unconditional, albeit twisted love for Sasha. He is the ultimate protector. Or is his erasure the ultimate triumph of psychological healing? By destroying the lab, the source of the trauma is gone. The protector is simply no longer needed. The biological firewall can finally be uninstalled so the user can actually use her own computer.
It is the ultimate act of altruistic sacrifice. He chooses non-existence out of love. And his internal sacrifice sets the stage for the massive political and philosophical resolutions that close out the narrative.
Let's transition to the political fallout, because while the underground lab is turning into a crater, there is a high-stakes, incredibly tense diplomatic chess match happening above ground between two very powerful figures, U.S. Ambassador Heidi Nagel and the director of the CIA, Gregory Judd.
Ambassador Nagel is a fantastic character. Throughout the story, she believes she was doing vital diplomatic work in Prague. But as the events unfold, she realizes she's been used as a pawn. Finch and Director Judd purposefully placed her in that specific embassy precisely because her pristine reputation provided the perfect, unimpeachable diplomatic cover for the construction and operation of Threshold.
But she is highly intelligent, and she is absolutely not willing to be collateral damage in a CIA cover-up. She manages to get her hands on the ultimate leverage, a smuggled USB drive containing the video file of the golem interrogating Dr. Gessner.
It is the smoking gun. The video is a full, terrified confession from Gessner detailing every horrific aspect of the operation. The illegal human experimentation, the involuntary surgical implants, the massive illegal drug trials, the weaponized remote viewing. It's an atomic bomb of a geopolitical leak.
Nagel plays her hand brilliantly. She sets up a dead man's switch. She informs Director Judd that she has 4 heavily encrypted copies of the drive ready to auto-distribute to the global press, the New York Times. Der Spiegel, The Guardian, if she, or anyone involved, is harmed. And she uses this immense leverage not to extort money or power, but to secure absolute protection for the victim. She forces Judd to grant safe asylum in the United States for Sasha Vesner.
It's a masterful, completely airtight diplomatic checkmate. She forces the agency that traumatized Sasha to expend its vast resources protecting her, ensuring she gets the highest level of psychiatric care and a completely new, untouchable life.
With the political threat neutralized and Langdon and Catherine finally safe, the narrative takes a deep breath and turns back to the core message that started it all, Catherine's surviving manuscript. And this is where the philosophy gets incredibly deep, tying everything together. Catherine's work relies heavily on a psychological framework known as terror management theory.
Terror management theory, or TMT, is a highly influential concept drawn from the work of cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, specifically his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death. TMT posits that human beings carry a unique, agonizing cognitive burden. Because of our advanced prefrontal cortex, we are the only species on Earth acutely aware of our own inevitable mortality. We know with absolute certainty that we are going to die. And according to TMT, this subconscious, overwhelming existential terror of our own impending non-existence is the invisible engine driving almost all human behavior.
It shapes our basic fight-or-flight responses, sure, but Catherine argues it goes way beyond that. TMT suggests that this terror shapes the very structures of our civilization. It drives our most destructive impulses. Why do we invent extreme nationalism? Why do we hoard vast, unnecessary amounts of wealth? Why do we engage in bitter religious intolerance or start catastrophic wars?
TMT argues we do these things to build immortality projects. We create conceptual frameworks, nations, corporations, legacies that will outlast our physical bodies. We desperately try to convince ourselves that we are part of something eternal, a collective soul, to buffer our fragile minds against the crushing terror of impermanence.
But Catherine's noetic conclusion is totally revolutionary. She argues that if her science can definitively prove her theories, if she can scientifically demonstrate, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that consciousness is non-local, that the radio signal continues broadcasting long after the radio is smashed, then that foundational existential terror simply evaporates.
The implications are staggering, Sarah. If death is definitively proven to not be the end of consciousness, but merely a transition, a shedding of the biological hardware, while the software continues its journey, The subconscious panic that drives human greed and tribalism loses its fuel source.
Catherine believes this would usher in a fundamental change in the human species. She envisions a utopian shift. A society no longer subconsciously terrified of oblivion would instantly become less tribal, less greedy, less prone to violence. We would recognize our profound, literal interconnectedness. We would become fundamentally more cooperative, peaceful, and empathetic.
It's a beautiful thought.
Okay, here is where my mind hits a wall, though, and I have to throw this out for debate. The vision is beautiful, but think about human history. Isn't the fear of death the exact engine of human innovation? The fear of our own fragility is precisely why we invented medicine, architecture, agriculture, and art.
That's a fair point.
If you remove the fear of mortality, if we all know for a fact that we're just eternal radio signals waiting to move to a new receiver when we die, do we actually achieve world peace? Or do we just lose our fundamental drive? Without the ticking clock of mortality, why build a hospital? Why cure cancer? Why strive to create anything lasting? Does the comfort of eternity just cause us to stagnate as a species?
That is the essential, brilliant tension at the heart of her theory. Does absolute spiritual certainty breed temporal apathy? If the stakes of physical survival are removed, does the human spirit soar, or does it simply go to sleep? Catherine might counter that innovation driven by love, curiosity, and empathy, and urge to explore the universe rather than just survive. It would far surpass the frantic, often destructive innovation driven by terror and self-preservation. It challenges us to imagine a completely different evolutionary driver for our species.
It is a massive paradigm-shifting thought experiment, and it perfectly encapsulates the journey we've been on today. We have traveled from the freezing dark waters of the Volga River through the deeply mythic and agonizingly psychological history of the Golem of Prague, and down into the claustrophobic, psychedelic, terrifying depths of a weaponized CIA laboratory. We've explored the absolute fringes of noetic science, the neurochemistry of how our brains filter reality, and the high-stakes, morally bankrupt world of clandestine intelligence.
We've seen the horrifying lengths to which powerful institutions will go to control the ultimate high ground, the human mind, and the extraordinary resilient lengths to which the human mind will go to protect itself from that control.
It has been a wild, deeply thought-provoking ride. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final haunting thought to mull over as you go about your day. Think back to that opening image. The brilliant neuroscientist, floating untethered above the cathedral, realizing her mind is entirely separate from her body. If Dr. Catherine Solomon is right, if your brain is really just a biological radio receiver, and your consciousness, your very soul, is a signal being broadcast from somewhere else in the universe, then who or what owns the broadcasting rights to your soul? And more importantly, what happens to you when the signal outlasts the hardware?